So much of world building, to me at least, seems like an excuse to play with interesting things. So much of what comes out in my own drawings, but also in all the work that I see online or I see in concept art books, which, most of that is just complicated world building under another name. So much of it is just playing with fun ideas. Sometimes when I was younger and I would watch the behind the scenes footage for the Lord of the Rings movies, I would find a little bit of frustration with the fact that some of the designs that they came up with, that the artists came up with for these characters or beasts, things like the Balrog or some of the crazy weapons, were so cool. And then the things that make it into the final film are a little bit more docile, a little bit more relaxed, a little bit less exaggerated. And as a kid, I was frustrated by that. I felt like it was such a missed opportunity. Like, you had these super cool designs of this giant fire demon, and you went with something more tame. But I think as an adult, I look at that stuff and go, every single time you do something crazy like that, you're asking your audience to suspend their disbelief. And you only have a certain amount of bandwidth there that they're going to give you. So it makes sense to not waste it all in a gratuitous spot. It makes more sense to be concerned and to be careful with how you spend that energy and make sure that when it is utilized, that it's utilized well. But the thing that is cool to me now as an adult, as somebody who works on building worlds, who is writing novels, I think that the coolest part is that even for those professionals, so much of the concept art and the world building is simply about exaggerating things and making exciting and cool things and seeing what sticks, seeing what actually makes sense as a finished product. And you almost have to overshoot sometimes before you can come back and see what works and what doesn't. It's the same reason why when I talk to people who are trying to write their novel or their comic or whatever for the first time, or digital artists who are trying to put things down and they're so concerned about making sure that it turns out perfectly or just really well the first time, I try to encourage them with the knowledge that once you have it down, it's editable. I mean, once you have a sketch, once you have a chapter, once you have anything that is actually existing in physicality, all of a sudden, it is now able to be edited. It can be manipulated. It can be changed. And there's so much power in that. I also wish that every one of my drawings and chapters and videos turned out perfectly. I know that that's impossible, but of course it would be nice, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be nice for you if everything you set out to do turned out well? But that's just not reality. And it's not reality because the things that we think we understand so well in our mind, those things are largely built of emotion. In fact, I had a classroom rule years ago when I was in the classroom professionally and daily that was basically like your ideas in your head are built of emotion, not actual physical things. And because of that, that is actually, I think, the reason why we can see images in our brains, or so we think, and then when we try to draw them and translate them, they don't translate perfectly. This is perhaps one of the most frustrating things that there is for artists. But the reality is that when you conjure an image in your mind, you're not seeing the reality of the image. You're seeing an impression of it. Our brains are really, really good at simplifying things. They simplify images, they simplify memories, they simplify songs, almost in the same way that a computer will zip files together. But the problem is that we don't necessarily know that that's happening because we're not actively aware of it, kind of like breathing. And there are some people where this doesn't happen, and generally this is what a photographic memory is. A photographic memory is generally a person whose brain is not capable of zipping files quite as well as other people. And it sounds like a wonderful gift, but a lot of people with photographic memories also have some other deficiency because essentially it's like running your computer with all the RAM consumed or with all of the hard drive space consumed. It's not how the computer's supposed to run, and so it's very, very, very taxing on the computer, and it's very taxing, or so it seems, on the human mind to have full access to all saved data. All of this to say that when you try to put something down on the page, it is incredibly common and normal for that thing not to turn out as well or in the exact fashion that you imagined. And this doesn't make you a bad artist or mean that you're not creative, it just means that you're human. It's hard for most of us to convey what exists in our mind. And the reality of that is that we are trying to convey something that is basically a wish and a desire, something that is comprised almost entirely of emotion and not of factual, physical, or visual data. And all of that comes back to you when you sit down to draw something, to world build especially, or work on something that is concept oriented. You are giving yourself the opportunity to bring things into existence. And once they exist, you have the opportunity to modify them, to change them, to make them more of what you want them to actually be. See, this drawing right now is turning out pretty well, honestly. I didn't have a lot of expectations for it. It was something that I was working on after I did some more detailed work, and so I was like, well, or more, not detailed, but like work that had to be something specific. And this was more of just play. And this is kind of a fun idea. And if this turns out well, cool. It's an idea that can then be incorporated into my stories. If it doesn't turn out well, then it's still something that I tried and something that might give me another piece to riff off of. And that's the biggest thing, is that every time you make a world building sketch, whether it comes out well or not, it's almost like you're figuring out how to fail. And I mean that in like a really good way. Because once you know that this particular way of doing something is not the right answer, you have effectively made it easier for yourself to find what the right answer is. Because there's only like a finite amount of ways that you're going to be able to solve that particular issue. In most cases, right? But the reality is you're going to get closer and closer to whatever it is that you want to achieve every time you kind of tinker with it and you mess with it. And oh, I just realized this was supposed to be that back horn, wasn't it? Oh well, that doesn't matter. But again, see, like that was a little mistake where I was just thinking too much about what I'm saying and not enough about what I'm drawing. But it doesn't really matter. The whole purpose of this drawing is to see if this idea will work and to see if it would be cool. And this idea specifically came from trying to think about adding more elements to my world, specifically in the writing, as I'm kind of writing a chapter right now about a pretty intense city that is very, very fantasy oriented. But I'm kind of realizing that like there's not a ton of fantasy elements in my world. Like so much of it is more just world elements, but nothing is crazy. And well, I mean, then you end up with giants or floating cities. But I wanted to incorporate some more elements that are high fantasy, like kind of cool, magical elements. And so that's what led to the creation of this drawing. Like, what if there's just like a giant skull from some kind of beast that nobody knows what it is, and it's been there so long that it's literally just a habitation? You know, at some point in the past, perhaps, when civilization was much less advanced, it was simply used as a shelter because it was shade from the desert heat or, you know, from torrential storms or something. And then over time, because it was just in a good location or the trade routes were already built to accommodate it, people actually started just living there and inhabiting it. And I kind of like that idea. I see things like this in some of the Zelda games. Sorry, it's hard sometimes when I'm drawing to think about what I want to say. And there's certainly elements of it in a lot of video games. I'm trying to think if there's something like that in Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of big ancient structures in Lord of the Rings, but not necessarily like dead corpses of things. But I think that this is kind of an interesting way to play with things, where obviously it's fantastic in nature. If you were to see something like this in a movie, like it would be so cool. But ironically, when you're writing about stuff like this in a novel, it just happens to be one of those things that after a few minutes, you kind of forget that there's anything crazy about it. Like there's a giant forest in one of my novels that the characters spend time in a couple times, and every time they get there, I always get the opportunity to describe how cool and fantastic it is. But after those intro paragraphs, unless I keep alluding to the fact that they're really high up, or that somebody is nervous because of how high up in the trees they are, or intricacies of the architecture that are specific to this arena, you just kind of read what the characters are doing, and you're there with them in whatever they're up to. The nice part about film and visual media and this kind of world building here where I'm drawing things is that you're constantly aware of the stuff you're looking at. If I turn this into a comic, for example, where I have characters visiting this, every panel is going to have pieces of this crazy background, and it's going to be, really cool. And that's one of the reasons why I think that there is some really cool benefits to mediums other than just writing, because you can communicate a lot of different things. And I don't know if it's better. I don't think so. I think it's mostly just, more interesting. But this is kind of the idea of exploring, what kind of crazy things can you do in your world, whether it is for a D&D campaign or a book or a video game or just some project in your mind that's fun to play with. But you kind of almost have to push it to the extreme to be able to see what's going to work. And then you can always pull back from whatever you do. So this one's kind of done for the moment. I'll probably let that dry entirely and then erase out the pencil lines and then color it. I have some others that I worked on a while back. I did on a session a long time ago, kind of working on these same ideas. This was my first attempt at putting watercolor into this sketchbook, which I have mixed feelings about. But then I drew these other two after the fact. These look like giant walnuts to me or something. It's just kind of funky. But again, this is trying to work on things that would be unique and interesting in a fantasy world that you wouldn't necessarily see in something else. And I like the idea of people living in a crazy kind of place, but just making do with it. Not pretending that it doesn't exist or that it's not weird, but mostly just living as humans do. If you go around to so many crazy places on our planet, there are just insane things. People live in such crazy different conditions, and you just kind of make do with and get used to whatever your normal is. But your normal is probably pretty crazy compared to someone else's. All right, I want to take a couple minutes here and talk about my process. I think it's been a long time since I've talked about that. Obviously, for a lot of these things, I have some idea of what I'm trying to achieve. So I'm not necessarily going to talk about the idea generation, but I have a feeling that pieces of that will come up. You'll notice like this is a really quickly drawn, just with pencil, and I use the red pencils because I like them, but it doesn't matter. You can use any kind of pencil. These are special red pencils that are erasable, but I will start with just a quick sketch with shapes. You can see the trees are just triangles. I did the same thing for this guy. And then these are going to be stone structures that are rising out of the ocean. This is the water here, or a big lake maybe. And I've given myself just enough pieces to kind of know where the shapes are going to be. If I get into something and I need to sketch more, I will. I am not married to every line I've set down, and I've got no pride with it. Like if I need to modify something, like I don't feel awkward doing that. Even on camera, I don't feel like, oh my goodness, somebody watching is going to be like, wait, your sketch was not official. I get that. It doesn't matter. Like throw that kind of stuff away. If you have those kind of concerns where like, I'm not in the sketching phase anymore, like I need to not go back to it. Like no, like that's all nonsense. So I will sketch out really loosely what I want. And then I'll often use one of these guys. This is a brush pen. This is still Pigma, made by the same company that makes the microns that I use most of the time, which I really love. But this guy just gives me a little bit of variance in the brush stroke, and I find that it makes the finished result look really interesting and far more textured than it would be otherwise. So I like to use this guy for a lot of the big sweeping kind of areas. I am still learning how to use this guy proficiently. This is one of the tools over the last couple years that has taken me the most time to really feel like I've got a good handle on. I will also leave a lot of these gaps, as you might have seen in some of my prior drawings. That's so I have the ability to come back later and fill them in. In these cases right here, I'll probably put grass there, and so I'll actually leave it like that. I find that sometimes just leaving gaps, they're easy to fill later if I need to, it's not a big deal, but often in the moment, I will just work on the outline and not think about the fact that, like, oh, it might be cool to have that line broken up by a piece of foliage going through it, or some grass, or a flag, or a character. And so I will artificially leave some of those gaps just to allow for more intriguing, kind of funky details that I can put in later if I want to. So I'm going to just use this and start sculpting out the sides of this structure. And then after I've done enough of that, I'll go in with this guy right here, which is my 01. It's just my basic micron. This is a 1/4 millimeter thickness. And that's probably the one I use the vast majority of the time. They make one that's half that thickness, but because it's so thin, I find that the tips tend to bend and dull incredibly quickly. And so while I would like to use them for all the work, they don't last that long. And so I can't quite do that. It would be nice. I feel like that would be ideal. And maybe there's another brand that makes one better. So if you have any ideas about stuff like that, please share below. And also while you're there, while you're thinking about it, while I'm thinking about it, what is your process for your world building sketches? Like, do you start with sketches or do you start with more profound ideas? I find that giving myself as much space to kind of slowly expand and build things out just makes it lower stress. And I think I do get better results because I don't have so much of a finished idea in my mind at the beginning. And that allows my mind to wander some. Sometimes I will do this while I'm listening to an audiobook or to YouTube videos. Obviously, when I'm doing them right now, like I am talking at real speed while I'm doing this. I'm not recording a voiceover. I try not to do voiceovers with the world building sessions. If I did, I know that my cadence of speech would be better. I could actually, script things. This is far more just me naturally working. I work a teeny bit slower while I'm recording. I'm more conscious of what I'm doing. I don't move my sketchbook around to get the best angles. And obviously, because I'm speaking over it at the same time, my mind is occupied with both. So that should give you a little bit of an idea just about how it's a slightly different process. And your process is going to look different depending on what your situation is. If you're working faster than me, like that's probably part of it. If you're working slower than me, well, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no shame in working slowly or working quickly. Both can be bad and both can be good depending on a lot of other components. I have a tendency to work pretty quickly, and I have a tendency not to put enough time into finishing things in the way that would be best given some of the circumstances. I like these kinds of little sketches and drawings because they're pretty rewarding. You can get something as a result pretty quickly, and then there's only so far that you can develop them before your time is just being wasted. And it works well for me. I do love doing long-term, really beautiful finished works, but I find that they're often pretty stressful for me to get started with. And maybe that's something I need to work on, and maybe not. Maybe that's just part of my process, and that's totally fine. It's hard sometimes to figure out which pieces of yourself as an artist you should modify and which pieces are simply just parts of your reality. I know that there's probably some people listening that feel like it's weird to modify any piece of yourself as an artist, but there's also a lot of people who think that art is only an individual thing and that it is totally subjective. And I don't think that art is totally subjective. I think there are huge components of it that are, but especially when it comes down to world building stuff where your desire is to get across something, to communicate something, either about your own world to yourself, or most commonly to other people. People who are going to see your world, or who need to be able to understand how they can play and exist with their characters inside it. Or if they're reading something, they need to understand what you're communicating. So it's not subjective. It's going to be subjective whether somebody likes your world or not, whether they think you've done a good job of illustrating it, whether it's beautiful. But how those elements are communicated, if those elements are communicated, those are far less subjective components. And so I am trying to focus on, oh man, I lost the plot there for a second, about what I was talking about with subjectivity and objectivity. All right, I need a moment. When it comes to this kind of art specifically, there is a purpose. And the purpose is going to be different for each of us. But inside of that particular purpose, there is going to be objective measurements of if you're successful or not. And that's okay. I know that that might feel strange or be a weird thing, and you are, of course, totally welcome to disagree with that. I am not asserting that my view is perfect, but, I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things, and I often think that it's better to form an opinion about these kinds of things and then subject that opinion to scrutiny, your own scrutiny and other people's scrutiny. And that's often how I find that ideas are honed, like metal. They're passed through the crucible of discussion, and you figure out if the opinion that you're holding is good or if it is bad. There are some opinions that are, not founded on anything, and you are welcome to have those, obviously, as a human being, but I, for one, would much rather have opinions that are based on some fragment of reality, something that can be, that can hold up to some scrutiny. That just seems way more comfortable to me. But you can see now I've moved on. This is the 0.2 millimeter, so actually not half, but this is the 0.2 millimeter one. And I am working on some of the baseline details. These drawings are just so small that using anything larger often feels as if I'm losing out on detail. So like I said, I would really vastly prefer to use this one all the time, but they just dull so quickly. If you take a moment and push too hard for just a second there, all of a sudden you push the little nib much further back up inside the pen, and then it doesn't work as well the next time, and it's frustrating. But that's part of the game, I suppose. I am going to switch though to this one and add in some trunks for these trees. You might wonder too why I put the cap back on my pens when I work. It's obviously not necessary. I don't have very large hands, but the way that my hands are structured, if I don't have this, it kind of tends to fall into my hand, and I don't have as good a place to brace it. So having the cap on makes it longer and makes it easier for my hand to hold it. I am right-handed. If you are left-handed, I would highly recommend that you don't work this way, but that you work this way. I had a friend in high school who was left-handed, one of the best artists I've ever known, and he had this funny quirk, something that he had adopted because of being left-handed. He actually learned to write English entirely in reverse. And he would do it in cursive, which just seems like such a flex. Like, what a crazy thing to learn how to do. So he would take his notes for classes and stuff in cursive totally backwards. But being left-handed as an artist is so much more forgiving than being left-handed as a student, especially here in the United States, where everything is written left to right. So you have a tendency to smudge and to wreck your writing. So if you are left-handed, let me know below, because it's an interesting psychological thing. There are a much higher percentage of artists that are left-handed than there are people that are left-handed in general. Something that I know was anecdotal in a lot of my studies, but then, it's something that really did seem to bear itself out in my teaching years. There were a lot higher percentage of my artists, the really successful ones who went on to do something with it, that were left-handed. So I would love to hear about that. If you've experienced something similar, or if you are yourself left-handed. There's a lot of them in the artistic community. I wish I was left-handed. I was kind of excited when my daughter was first starting to draw because I thought that she might be left-handed for a while, but she has standardized into right-handed. She still does a lot of things with both hands, and I think some of that might just be that she's young. So I don't think it has like a ton of effects. There used to be some stuff about how like you use the left side of your brain for these things and the right side of your brain for certain things. People used to think that, the right side of your brain was the creative side. I think a lot of that's been debunked, but it takes a lot of time for those kinds of thoughts to leave the public eye because science keeps progressing. And sometimes, you get people who go, well, back in my day, that's not what we knew. And it's like, yeah, but that's because science keeps progressing. It's not like you were lied to. It's just that the information has improved or is different. Sometimes it's hard. I've had things like that in my own life where it's like, no, this was the method we used and it worked for us, so it'll work for you. And it's like, yeah, but sometimes like just because it worked doesn't mean it was the best way to do things. There's a lot of things they did back in the day that were not great. They used to bleed people out thinking that would get rid of their illnesses, and they used to, think that the interior components of the human body were made up of a couple different liquids and stuff. So science is good. Science improves over time, and it helps us live longer and have better lives. And I think one of the biggest scientific and medical things in the last couple decades has been understanding the nuances, or at least beginning to understand the nuances of mental health and how it impacts so many other components of our lives, especially for creatives and for artists, because so much of what we're working on all the time requires a heightened sense of awareness of our emotions. And it's incredibly hard to work on beautiful, creative things when you have mental health issues that are weighing heavily upon you. And I think we're starting to move away from the idea of the tortured artist, that like artists need to be miserable. And I'm glad for that, because that seems like for a long time that was just understood, that like, oh yeah, like the greatest music is coming out of people who are doing all kinds of drugs and who are very, very depressed and having, a really terrible time in life. And there's a lot of notions about that about artists like Van Gogh. And obviously there's truth in those thoughts. But the idea that that is all artists, or that no good, beautiful thing comes without, depression and pain. I like that we're challenging some of those things. And, the hard part of that is that I think most good art has to come out of some place of pain, but I think sometimes it's just from a person having experienced those elements in their life. I think about Tolkien's work, and a lot of the trauma that he had to endure in World War I is what led to these epic scenes and these characters that feel fleshed out and real, and an understanding of why Sauron and Saruman are structured the way that they are. And so I don't know, but again, like even in this little diatribe or whatever, I'm like, well, okay, so like the tortured artist isn't necessarily like an accurate representation, but yet it does seem to me that even as I'm talking about this, that pain is necessary for the growth that allows for good art to come into fruition. And I guess that doesn't mean that you as an artist need to live in pain constantly and have a tortured existence, but it likely means that your art is going to be better if you have experienced more of the world. And hopefully that hasn't been a tremendous amount of pain. But the reality is, you are going to understand more about what it is to be human the more life you have experienced. I saw somebody not that long ago who was writing about what's different in fantasy fiction these days versus in the past. And one of the big things was, a lot of the conflict and the war and the fights and the combat now are dramatically different. And somebody else was able to sit there and go, yeah, but like back in the day when people wrote about these things, if they hadn't been in war themselves, if they haven't experienced combat or been in the armed forces themselves, a ton of people in their lives had been. And I think now we have people that are just further divorced from that. And in a lot of ways, that's a wonderful thing that we have fewer people who are experiencing those kinds of things. But it's it's easier to write about things that you've seen and that you've experienced. So when it comes to world building and writing, I suppose the lesson there is, don't go to war, obviously, but like the more you get out and do things and experience in life, the more it's going to contribute to your art and your writing being richer because you've simply experienced more things. And I think it's really important. I did a podcast, I think maybe a year ago, about the importance of getting outside and going on adventures and stuff as an artist. And I think that's super, super important. If you want to, be an artist who conveys bits and pieces of character development and tells stories and wants to capture, what it is to be human and communicate things to other people through your artwork, like, you've got to be out there doing things, because if you are experiencing more of what it is to be human, that's going to start coming through in your artwork. And people are going to pick up on those things. And I don't think a lot of that's necessarily stuff that's trackable. It's a quality that people are just going to feel rather than finish looking at your piece and be like, ah, yes, this person has obviously endured some hard times in their life. Sometimes that's the case, but that's probably when it's far more overt. And I think that in most cases, it's going to be just something that's going to feel more accurate, more fulfilled, more true. Well, I had a couple other things I was planning on talking about today, but I kind of meandered. And mostly now I'm just hoping that things kind of made sense. When I don't have a script and I can't go back like in the video and see what I was talking about earlier, sometimes it's hard to make sure that what I said makes sense. So thank you for bearing with me. And I hope that this has been good background material while you're working on your own world building or whatever it is that you're up to. I had intended to talk about designing world building stuff and the concept of, like, do you come up with the idea first or the design first, and which do you let manipulate you as you move forward? And I think I'll plan on talking about that in the next segment of this. And I just want to focus on whether you should start with a clear-cut idea, or if you just start making things and then try to bend them into fitting in your world. And obviously I think both are doable, so it's going to be fun, I hope, to talk about those concepts and talk about what might be more beneficial to you depending on what kind of artist and writer you are, or what kind of creative you are, or where you're coming from, how much you've thought about the things that you're going to be working on. At some point, it might not be a bad idea, too, to talk about the different kind of worlds that you might be building, and if it's significantly different if you're just building a world for yourself, or if you are trying to write. I talk about my writing here because it's integral to my world building, but I know not every one of you listening is a writer. That some of you are just building the worlds because they're fun, and I want to encourage you to do that because I think that's a good idea. I think that's a noble pursuit. So at some point that might be worth talking about too. But I'm going to go ahead and close out this session. So thanks for being here. Thanks for hanging out with me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was beneficial to you. Thank you to my patrons as well who are on the screen right now. If you want to check out the Patreon or the Discord, they are both linked below. I hope you will continue building your worlds and building some beautiful things and bringing them into fruition. As always, feel free to ask any questions below. I still read all the comments, though it takes me a little bit of time sometimes to get to them. And if you have anything specific you'd like me to talk about in these sessions, let me know. I will add it to the list, and we will start moving forward on it. All right. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.